The architecture of a strong argument, a living structure of truth. Introduction. A strong argument serves not merely as a set of logically linked propositions, but as a living structure of truth, a dynamic, layered, and adaptive entity that grounds its claims across multiple dimensions of reality and reasoning. In a world saturated with information, persuasion, and disagreement, the concept of the strong argument has become central to philosophy, law, science, and public discourse. This report aims to define and explore the notion of a strong argument as a living structure, emphasizing its grounding in empirical, ontological, and modal dimensions, and highlighting essential properties: motivation, minimal complexity, insightfulness, adaptability, and emotional resonance. Drawing on developments from philosophical, ethical, metaphysical, legal, and scientific frameworks, the report weaves together contemporary and classical theories of truth, including correspondence, coherence, consensus, and pragmatic theories. Through this comprehensive analysis, we seek to illuminate what it means for an argument to be not just valid, but vivid, compelling, and truly strong. Layered reasoning and argumentation. The concept of layered reasoning. Layered reasoning refers to constructing arguments in which multiple inferential steps are interconnected to support a central claim. Each layer can represent a different type of justification, such as empirical evidence, logical principle, ethical norm, or metaphysical assumption. In practical argument mapping, these layers can be visualized as a chain or hierarchy, making explicit the steps that bridge premises and conclusions. The structure of such an argument is akin to scaffolding, where each premise provides support for subsequent premises, culminating in the main claim. This approach not only strengthens the logical integrity of the argument, but also enhances transparency by clarifying the rationale behind each inference. For example, the chain argument format, where each reason supports the next, allows evaluators to scrutinize each link for soundness and relevance. Analytical foundations and examples. Layered reasoning is foundational in both formal and informal argumentation. In ethical debates, an argument against capital punishment may be grounded first in empirical claims about deterrence, followed by moral reasoning based on the sanctity of life, and finally, broader societal implications. Recent scholarship on argument mapping tools highlights that breaking down complex arguments into layers enables learners and professionals to diagnose weaknesses, identify unstated assumptions, and fortify arguments by addressing gaps. In philosophy, this approach is reflected in the analytic tradition's preference for explicit, staged argumentation, as seen in Kantian moral arguments or Quine's web of belief. Philosophical and practical implications. Layered reasoning encapsulates the organic, evolving nature of strong arguments. They are not static monoliths, but dynamic structures that can evolve as new information is integrated. This feature is critical in fields like law and science, where argument structures need to adapt to incremental discoveries and revised frameworks. By foregrounding the role of inference chains and argument mapping, layered reasoning provides practitioners with both a methodology and a metacognitive tool to refine the architecture of argument. Theoretical engagement in arguments. Defining theoretical engagement. A strong argument is not merely the sum of its premises, it actively engages with existing theories, situating itself within ongoing intellectual conversations. Theoretical engagement involves referencing, critiquing, or extending established intellectual frameworks, whether they are philosophical schools like utilitarianism or deontology, scientific paradigms like evolution or relativity, or legal doctrines such as precedent and statutory interpretation. Role in philosophy and science. Within philosophy, theoretical engagement is evident in how arguments address or reinterpret canonical theories of truth, mind, or justice. For example, an argument about consciousness might engage with both physicalist and dualist theories to position its own claims, anticipating counterarguments from competing schools. In the sciences, theoretical engagement means grounding claims in the broader context of existing research and models. Scientific arguments do not merely present isolated observations, they articulate how new data supports, challenges, or extends established theories, ensuring their credibility and relevance. Examples and application. An argument for universal basic income, for instance, benefits from situating itself within economic theories about resource distribution, philosophical theories about justice, and ethical debates about fairness. By actively engaging with, rather than ignoring, influential theories, the argument becomes more robust, insightful, and less likely to be dismissed as naive or uninformed. Meta-level insight. Strong arguments thrive on engagement rather than isolation. They are open systems capable of meaningful dialogue with relevant intellectual traditions. This engagement not only bolsters persuasive power, but also ensures that arguments are subject to necessary scrutiny and refinement by the communities they hope to influence. Truth grounding, empirical dimension. The role of empirical evidence. Empirical grounding refers to anchoring arguments in observable reality via data, experiments, or first-hand testimony. In philosophy of science and epistemology, empirical evidence is the gold standard for validating claims about the natural world. Arguments grounded empirically can draw upon statistics, scientific experiments, and systematic observation. In legal contexts, empirical grounding is essential for arguments about causation, impact, or mens rea, relying on forensic evidence or statistical analysis to underpin legal claims. Criteria for strong empirical arguments. Relevance. Data must directly pertain to the key claim. Reliability. Evidence is gathered using consistent and rigorous methods. Replicability. Claims can be tested and verified by independent sources. Illustrations in legal and scientific discourse. A classic example is the legal argument in Brown versus Board of Education, where psychologists' empirical studies on the impact of segregation provided a factual foundation supporting the claim that separate but equal is inherently unequal. In the sciences, arguments about climate change rest on vast troves of empirical data, temperature records, ice core analysis, and atmospheric modeling. Philosophical reflection. While empirical grounding lends arguments strong initial credibility, it is not infallible. Empirical claims must be interpreted, contextualized, and integrated within theoretical frameworks. A strong argument weaves empirical support with critical reasoning and theoretical engagement, forming a composite structure that is more than just a collection of facts. Truth grounding, ontological dimension. What is ontological grounding? Ontological grounding concerns the nature of reality and the existence of entities referenced by an argument. Whereas empirical grounding appeals to observable phenomena, ontological grounding addresses deeper questions about what things are, what categories they fall into, and how they exist. In metaphysics, ontological claims evaluate whether certain concepts like causality, numbers, or moral values have real existence or are mere abstractions. Ontological arguments in philosophy. The ontological argument for the existence of God, formulated by Anselm and later revised by philosophers like Descartes and Plantinga, is an explicit illustration. Its premises are not empirical but instead rely on the logic of being and necessity. Similarly, debates in philosophy of mind around the existence of qualia or consciousness are ontologically structured, addressing what kinds of things conscious experiences are. Application in law and ethics. In law, ontological grounding arises when defining what constitutes a person under the law. Consider debates in bioethics about personhood and moral status, which hinge on ontological distinctions between potentiality, actuality, and consciousness. Ethical arguments about rights and duties often require an ontological examination of moral responsibility and agency. Integrative insight. An argument's ontological layer clarifies what exists and how it is classified, providing depth and stability to the claims made. When arguments lack ontological clarity, say by equivocating between different senses of freedom or cause, they become susceptible to confusion and misapplication. Thus, grounding in ontology is a key differentiator between superficially persuasive and truly formidable arguments. Truth grounding, modal dimension. Modal reasoning explained. The modal dimension refers to arguments that invoke possibility, necessity, and contingency. Modal claims do not just state what is, but what could be, must be, or might not have been. Modal logic thus enriches argumentation, expanding its reach beyond the actual to the possible worlds, hypothetical scenarios, and counterfactuals. Use in metaphysics, science, and law. Modal thinking is central in metaphysics and philosophy of science. For instance, arguments about causation often rely on counterfactual conditionals. If X had not occurred, Y would not have occurred, while debates about free will and determinism hinge on modal concepts like necessity and contingency. In law, the modal dimension appears in tort law, where causation is often modeled counterfactually. Would the harm have occurred but for the defendant's action? In ethics, modal reasoning helps establish what agents ought to do, not just what they actually do. Examples: a scientific argument claiming a gene necessarily causes a disease is making a modal statement about causation. An ethical argument that says one ought always to tell the truth is asserting a modal normative claim, what is required, not just what is the case. Advanced insights. Modal grounding enables arguments to generalize, forecast, hypothesize, and universalize, making them adaptable to new contexts and resistant to minor empirical anomalies. It connects arguments not just to present facts, but to potentialities, rendering their conclusions broadly relevant and robust. The motivating aspect of strong arguments. What does it mean for an argument to be motivating? A strong argument must not only be logically sound and well-grounded, but also motivating, that is compelling enough to prompt belief, action, or further inquiry. Motivation can stem from perceived consequences, relevance to personal values, or emotional engagement with the subject matter. Mechanisms of motivation. Arguments are motivating when they address real problems or urgent concerns, connect logically to the reader's interests or background, evoke intuitive responses or emotional resonance, pathos, demonstrate practical impact or real-world significance. Philosophical and scientific perspectives. Recent psychological research into motivated reasoning shows that people are more likely to be persuaded by arguments that align with their interests, values, or identity, even when contrary evidence is available. This highlights the importance of understanding the audience's context and priorities. In formal structures like academic or legal argumentation, the motivation is often made explicit. Why does this matter? What is at stake if the claim is accepted or rejected? Strong arguments make their stakes visible, signaling significance and urgency. Insightful applications. The motivating dimension thus intersects with rhetorical theory, ethos, pathos, logos, and with modern research on the psychology of persuasion. By acknowledging and activating the motivating aspects, strong arguments transcend cold ratiocination and become active forces in intellectual life. Minimal complexity in argument design. The principle of simplicity. Minimal complexity does not mean oversimplification, but achieving maximum clarity and impact with the fewest necessary moving parts. Philosophers, designers, and legal theorists all emphasize the need to pare away unwarranted complications, distinguishing the essential from the extraneous. Why simplicity matters. Simplicity in argument structure allows greater transparency and accessibility, easier evaluation of truth and validity, reduced likelihood of logical errors and ambiguities. The systematic approach to achieving simplicity, as discussed in recent design studies, involves prioritizing clarity, organizing ideas logically, and eliminating redundancy while preserving necessary detail. Practical examples. The structure of a basic syllogism, 2 premises and a conclusion, exemplifies simplicity. Legal arguments that distill complex cases into a few clear principles, for example, the rule, the facts, the application, make it easy for judges and juries to follow reasoning and deliver just decisions. Philosophical reflection. Minimal complexity is a virtue not only in rhetoric, but in ethical, metaphysical, and scientific discourse. The best arguments clarify rather than obscure. This aligns with Occam's razor, a principle urging us not to multiply entities or explanations beyond necessity. Arguments that exhibit minimal complexity tend to possess stronger explanatory and persuasive power. Insightfulness in arguments. Characteristics of insightfulness. An insightful argument offers novel perspectives, deep understanding, or clarifying distinctions that transform the audience's perception of the issue. Insightfulness can result from identifying hidden assumptions, drawing surprising connections, or formulating new principles. Insightful arguments. illuminate aspects of the problem previously ignored, recast familiar problems in new terms, uncover underlying causes or frameworks, advance the discussion beyond cliché or stasis. Role in philosophy, law, and science. In philosophy, insightfulness often takes the form of counterintuitive thought experiments, such as the trolley problem or Gettier cases, which disrupt conventional wisdom and provoke deeper exploration. In law, landmark cases bring new interpretative insights that reverberate across the system. Scientific revolutions, such as Einstein's reimagining of space and time, are paradigms of insightfulness, reframing fundamental concepts and suggesting novel predictions. Mechanisms for generating insight. Techniques include analyzing paradoxes or apparent contradictions, comparing and contrasting alternative frameworks, re-expressing the problem through analogies, metaphors, or models. Insightful arguments are thus not just strong but generative. They catalyze further inquiry, innovation, and learning. Adaptability of arguments. Why adaptability matters. Arguments are situated within shifting contexts, cultural, scientific, legal, technological, and must adapt to retain their force. Adaptability means the argument is flexible enough to accommodate new evidence, perspectives, or counterarguments without collapsing into incoherence. Forms of adaptability. Adaptability can take the form of revising premises in light of new data, anticipating objections and integrating rebuttals, modifying or generalizing principles as wider cases emerge. Example in science and law. In science, the shift from Newtonian to quantum mechanics required not the abandonment, but the adaptation of established reasoning to new experimental realities. Similarly, legal arguments often evolve as new precedents are set or regulations are amended. Philosophical and practical insight. Adaptability embodies the living quality of argumentation. It acknowledges that truth and justification are not static, but interact dynamically with the world and our understanding of it. Strong arguments are not brittle artifacts, but evolving, responsive structures, capable of withstanding scrutiny and transforming in the face of change. Emotional resonance in arguments. The role of emotion. While traditional logic emphasizes cold rationality, a growing body of evidence highlights the indispensable role of emotional resonance in making arguments strong and persuasive. Emotional resonance does not supplant reason, but complements it by anchoring abstract claims in personal experience, empathy, and shared concerns. Modes of emotional appeal. Arguments may achieve resonance by sharing narratives or anecdotes that humanize abstract issues, tapping into universal values, hopes, or fears, using rhetorical devices and vivid language for greater impact, demonstrating moral urgency or invoking justice. Empirical findings. Research indicates that audiences remember, understand, and are motivated by arguments that connect logically and emotionally. Legal and political rhetoric often strategically integrates pathos, underscoring the stakes for real people. Philosophical reflection. Emotional resonance bridges the gap between intellectual assent and practical action. Without it, arguments may be internally sound but externally inert. By acknowledging the affective dimensions, strong arguments become not just true but moving, capable of changing minds, hearts, and behaviors. Philosophical frameworks. Metaphysics, ethics, legal, and scientific. Metaphysical framework. Metaphysics provides the ontological and modal foundations required for deep reasoning. Arguments about existence, causality, and necessity draw on metaphysical distinctions between substance and attribute, possible worlds, and the structure of reality. For example, the distinction between necessary and contingent truths, central to modal reasoning, is a metaphysical principle. Ethical framework. Ethical argumentation often hinges on layered and theoretically engaged reasoning. Competing frameworks, utilitarianism, deontology, virtue ethics, provide different foundations for ethical claims, requiring arguments to clarify and defend their normative structure. A strong ethical argument engages both the empirical, which refers to the facts of the case, and the philosophical, which refers to the theories of right action. Legal framework. Legal argumentation is a highly formalized process in which layered reasoning, empirical grounding, and ontological distinctions are crucial. Legal arguments must reference statutes, precedent, and evidentiary standards, while also adapting to changing societal norms and contexts. Scientific framework. Science demands empirical grounding, theoretical engagement, and adaptability in light of new evidence. The logic of scientific arguments follows distinctive patterns, hypothesis, evidence, testing, and theory formation, but also incorporates philosophical concerns such as falsifiability, coherence, and explanatory scope. Integration of frameworks. The strongest arguments transcend disciplinary boundaries, integrating insights from metaphysics, ethics, law, and science. For instance, debates about artificial intelligence engage metaphysical questions about consciousness, ethical questions about rights and responsibilities, legal questions about liability, and scientific questions about capability and risk. Formal argumentation formats. Overview of formal methods. Formal argumentation formats employ explicit premises, deductive or inductive rules, and precise conclusion structures. Common formal formats include: here is the text to convert. Format, structure, example. Deductive syllogism. Premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. All humans are mortal. Socrates is human. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Modus ponens. If P, then Q. P implies Q. If it rains, the ground is wet. It rains implies the ground is wet. Disjunctive syllogism. P or Q, not P, implies Q. Tea or coffee, not tea, implies coffee. Hypothetical syllogism. If P, then Q. If Q, then R. P, therefore R. If light, then plants grow. If plants grow, then they thrive. Light, therefore thrive. Inductive generalization. Observations implies probable rule. Every swan observed is white implies all swans are white, probable. Formalized argument structures enable systematic assessment of validity and soundness. Elaboration and application. The use of formal formats ensures clarity, precision, and evaluability. They are favored in mathematics, logic, law, and the sciences, where precision and explicitness are paramount. However, formal methods can sometimes limit adaptability if they fail to accommodate context-specific nuances or empirical complexities. The rapid expansion of computational and artificial intelligence research has led to further formalizations, such as argument frameworks in AI that define strict rules for attack, support, and defeat relations among arguments. Recent developments have focused on capturing the complexity of natural language arguments using formal graph structures, making the interdisciplinary study of arguments both precise and scalable. Informal argumentation formats. Informal structure. Informal arguments operate outside strict logical form, instead relying on rhetorical, narrative, or analogical strategies. This format is common in everyday communication, journalism, political debate, personal conversation, and certain types of philosophical and scientific discourse. Features of informal argumentation. Use of examples, anecdotes, or analogies. Implicit rather than explicit logical connections. Appeals to common sense, values, or shared experiences. Value and challenges. The virtue of informal arguments lies in their accessibility, adaptability, and resonance with everyday reasoning. However, informal argumentation is susceptible to logical fallacies, equivocation, and rhetorical manipulation. For example, in a debate about climate change, an informal argument may appeal to visible weather events. We have never had winters this warm before, rather than systematic empirical data. While this may be emotionally resonant, its logical rigor is weaker than a well-structured formal proof. Recent advances. Researchers in informal logic have developed tools and guidelines such as Toulmin's model claim, data, warrant, rebuttal to bridge the gap between formal rigor and informal persuasion. These hybrid approaches help evaluate everyday arguments for both credibility and cogency, offering checklists to diagnose bias, unsupported assertions, or hidden assumptions. Theories of truth and their role in strong arguments. Correspondence theory of truth. The correspondence theory holds that a statement is true if it accurately describes a state of affairs in the world. This theory underpins empirical and scientific argumentation, where claims are evaluated by their fit with observable reality. A strong argument grounded in correspondence will align with credible data or established facts, be vulnerable to disproof by counter-evidence. Limitations include difficulties in defining what constitutes a fact and resolving the status of unobservable entities or abstract constructs. Coherence theory of truth. The coherence theory posits that truth consists in the mutual consistency and support among a set of beliefs or propositions. Arguments are strong insofar as their claims harmonize with an established worldview or system. This model is especially relevant in mathematics, ethics, and philosophy, where internal consistency often trumps direct empirical data. Its challenge lies in the possibility of constructing internally coherent but factually incorrect systems, for example, conspiracy theories. Consensus theory of truth. Consensus theory maintains that something is true if it is agreed upon by an appropriately constituted group or community. Arguments draw strength from their capacity to achieve rational agreement and to be justified in the eyes of relevant stakeholders. This approach shapes legal decisions, jury verdicts, precedents, and political discourse, democratic legitimacy. However, it risks equating truth with popularity, overlooking lone but correct dissenters. Pragmatic theory of truth. Pragmatic theory links truth to practical consequences and workability. A claim is true if believing it works in practice or leads to successful outcomes. In science and technology, arguments often succeed or fail based on their utility rather than strict correspondence or consensus. The pragmatic model elevates experimentalism and adaptability, but may ignore deeper ontological or ethical concerns by focusing narrowly on what works. Integrative reflection. A truly strong argument is likely to engage more than one theory of truth, grounding itself in empirical correspondence, system-wide coherence, broad consensus, and practical consequences. This synthetic approach provides depth, resilience, and relevance beyond the limits of any single tradition. Recent philosophical discoveries and refinements. Evolving notions of truth and argument. In the past decade, philosophers have developed multi-level or nested theories of truth, recognizing that truth may operate hierarchically at different levels: literal, contextual, normative, and modal. This framework suggests that strong arguments should be evaluated not merely on face value, but with respect to layers of context, purpose, and audience. Advances in argument mapping. Recent refinements in argument mapping and computational models have enabled scholars to more precisely deconstruct, visualize, and evaluate arguments for their layered reasoning, ontological commitments, and adaptability. These tools facilitate the identification of weak links and the strengthening of complex argument chains. Insights from cognitive and social psychology. Studies in motivated reasoning confirm that logical soundness alone is insufficient. Successful arguments must also account for cognitive biases, emotional factors, and group dynamics. The application of engagement theory from educational psychology demonstrates that learners are more likely to internalize and act upon arguments when these are meaningfully connected to personal interests and values. Legal and ethical refinements. In law and ethics, the emergence of living constitutionalism and contextual ethical frameworks reflects a move away from rigid formulae towards dynamic, context-sensitive reasoning. Arguments that anticipate legal, social, and technological change are not only stronger, they are more just. They embody what Ronald Dworkin called law as integrity, where principles evolve to reflect deeper moral commitments rather than static precedent. Strong legal arguments now often integrate survivor testimony, restorative justice models, and intersectional analysis. These formats challenge traditional syllogistic logic by introducing narrative, affect, and communal harm as valid epistemic inputs. In ethics, frameworks like care ethics, Gilligan, Held, and relational autonomy, Nadelsky, reframe strength not as abstraction, but as responsiveness attuned to vulnerability, power, and trust. Moreover, legal reasoning increasingly embraces modal and ontological dimensions. Consider the use of counterfactuals in tort law, what would have happened if, or the ontological debates in bioethics around personhood and moral status. These arguments are strong not because they are airtight, but because they are alive, capable of evolving with new evidence, new harms, and new hopes. In this way, the architecture of a strong argument becomes a scaffold for justice. It is not merely persuasive, it is transformative. It does not just win cases, it redefines what counts as harm, care, and truth. Concession, the limits and tensions of strong argumentation. While this framework offers a robust architecture for strong arguments layered, truth-grounded, and emotionally resonant, it must also concede its own boundaries. Contextual fragility. What resonates as strong in one cultural, legal, or metaphysical context may falter in another. Arguments grounded in Western ontologies or empirical traditions may not translate across indigenous, relational, or spiritual epistemologies. Emotional underdetermination. Emotional resonance is subjective. An argument that activates agency in one listener may provoke alienation or resistance in another. The architecture cannot guarantee universal effective impact. Truth pluralism. Operating across correspondence, coherence, consensus, and pragmatic theories of truth introduces tension. These theories may conflict. What is pragmatically useful may not correspond to empirical reality, and communal consensus may obscure ontological depth. Survivor testimony and epistemic authority. While survivor testimony is honored as a format, it often struggles for recognition within formal systems. The architecture must grapple with epistemic injustice, whose truths are permitted to count as strong. Transformation versus stability. A strong argument must be adaptable, yet too much transformation risks losing its grounding. The balance between evolution and integrity remains a philosophical tension. This concession does not weaken the framework, it completes it. A strong argument, like any living structure, must acknowledge its thresholds. It must remain open to revision, contradiction, and collapse so that new architectures may rise.